First up is Farrel Davis with the Coonamessett Farm Foundation, who is it 16 years that you started fishing? 16 years old? Okay, so a guy with dirt under his nails and some real industry practical knowledge. And in my experience, when you marry the industry experience and expertise with the expertise that comes from the science world, that's really where the rubber meets the road and where the magic happens. And so I'm glad that you are here. Thanks, Farrel.
Yeah. Hello. So as Dana said, my name's Farrel Davis. I've been working for Coonamessett Farm Foundation for now the better part of 13 years. Prior to that, I was working on sea scallop vessels out of Chatham and day boats. And I'm here to present an overview of the work that we've done, at least over the past 10 years. But I'm also going to start with Ron Smolowitz's original work at the Seastead Project. So transplanting research since 1993. The earliest project was Ron's Seastead project that we could find, and it was a part of the Sea Scallop Working Group, which, much like this workshop here, was a consortium of members of state and federal government agencies, academic institutions, environmental interests, and industry, all with the goal of exploring methods to enhance the sea scallop resource, which at the time had completely collapsed. Going from there, in 2013 through 2017, we had some transplanting research where we started looking at ways to kind of fine tune how we optically monitor the sites. And then in response to a massive extraordinary recruitment event that had occurred in the Nantucket Lightship deep south, we began doing research looking at relay mortality relative to different gear types that would be used to potentially transplant scallops, as well as determining if transplanting those scallops from the deep water to a shallower region would actually improve their growth. And then in our current iteration, we're kind of trying to bring it all together to kind of have a more comprehensive idea of how to explain kind of a framework of how to monitor, how to determine whether the bed's growing, and maybe factors that are limiting the bed's growth or persistence. So this slide I really like. It presents in the background, you have scallop landings by region for the Mid-Atlantic and New England. And it shows when the past and current research has taken place relative to important sea scallop management amendments. Amendment 5, which was part of the Seastead project, which was the first aquaculture lease in federal waters. And to do this research in the Seastead project required them to get an amendment to the scallop fishery management plan. And then during that time, to find scallops to actually transplant into the bed, they needed to gain access to the groundfish areas, which then through Framework 11 and Framework 13 was kind of rotational management, if you will, and then it was finalized by Amendment 10. And during this time period, we had really no transplanting research. The resource was doing really well. In 2013 and 2012 to 2013, though, we had this extraordinary recruitment event, which eventually provided seed for us to do our research in the Nantucket Lightship Deep, as well as in other parts of Closed Area 1. So for this presentation, though, I'm going to define transplanting to differentiate it from other forms of bottom sowing. What we're going to be talking about specifically is utilizing juvenile, adult, and wild scallops with the mean shell height around 75 millimeters is what we've been transplanting. They're harvested from wild beds and then brought to another area with the goal of optimizing their yield. So the Seastead project started around 1993. It was a 3-year endeavor. I think by the time they finally got the permits, though, it was 1995, and the actual work was 1998 when it ended. They evaluated, in addition to transplanting, multiple grow-out mechanisms. They had bottom cages, lantern nets. For lantern nets, unfortunately, they lost all the gear during that time period, so they have no data. For bottom cages, they found one of the highest mortality rates during this study, but they also had a better growth rate relative to transplanting. Transplanting had a lower mortality, but also a lower growth rate. One of the major issues that this project ran into was needing a amendment to the Scallop FMP, citing the area was huge. Also getting an EFP to enter into the groundfish closures was a huge limitation. So they weren't able to source seed from a groundfish closure when they wanted to. And then another major component of the project was an economic assessment of each of the techniques that were evaluated. So when they did an economic assessment, and this is 30 years ago, so bear in mind that the price of scallop meats has gone up substantially from $7 a pound. But the economic assessment wanted to look into how an operation scaled to bring to market 40,000 pounds of work, whether it would be profitable. And they also performed a sensitivity analysis on different parameters within the model to see if, for example, alternatives, changing cages prices and other baseline assumptions would actually make cage culture profitable, and what the impact of dockside price as well as mortality would have on the profitability of seeding. So in the table, we have all the assumptions that were placed into the model for the economic assessment. What they found was the only profitable grow out technique that they investigated during the study was transplanting. At the time, it would have required $400,000 in startup capital. They estimated that it would have paid back in 4 years. For the aquaculture lease side, it would, relative to the other techniques that they tested, it required the most area. But relative to the other techniques too, though, it required the least amount of vessel time per year. With transplanting, though, they found that prices as low as $4 a pound and a loss rate as high as 50% could still make it marginally profitable. And that at $6 a pound, you could tolerate loss rates as high as 70%. And they also found that distance of the farming site relative to the port was not as important as location of the harvest site relative to the wild, or the transplanting site relative to the wild harvest site. So again, here's the outcomes of the models in terms of what it actually was predicting to make it profitable. You can see that for the cage methods, all cage methods that they tested, there was a negative NPV value. Transplanting was the only one that had a positive NPV. Within the cage structure under this, or within cage methods under this economic analysis, costs of the gear were dominating everything. They tried 2 different bottom cage methods. They called bottom cage clusters and then bottom cage trawls. The trawls ended up coming closest to breaking even. But this all in consideration with right now, current average scallop prices are double what the model had used, if not even higher. And also technology has improved. So the cost of cage method techniques might have come down, but in the backdrop of entanglement and vertical line issues, the necessary need to potentially use ropeless gear might offset any of the reduced cost gained from manufacturing improvements. So post Seastead research, so renewed interest started around 2013 with an award of an RSA that we received, and we started looking at enhancement within the DHRA, which is an area south of closed area 1. And we wanted to look at first whether that area would improve growth. But as we were doing the experiment, we found that locating the scallops post-seeding was a challenge. So we started evaluating different techniques using different optical survey platforms to determine which one would be ideal for relocating scallops post-transplanting. We also evaluated a dispersal model with the SMAS group, where scallops were treated as passive particles and released at the transplant site to see where they would possibly end up within a week. Then we also developed time-lapse camera stands, which allowed us to look at more fine-scale dispersal behavior and predator and prey interactions. And then with the extraordinary recruitment event that occurred within the Nantucket Lightship Deep, our focus shifted toward methods to reduce relay mortality, which is the mortality during transplanting, going from the harvest site to the transplant site, and what gears, whether it's a scallop dredge or trawl, would be ideal for that, and also determine test assumptions whether actually transplanting these scallops from deeper water to a more productive shallow grow-out site would improve their growth. So in terms of optical platforms that we've investigated, the Seastead project used a towed sled. It had a high 8 camcorder. I don't even think they make VHSs anymore, but it worked. But now we're 10, 20 years later, we have the HabCam vehicle, which we use to monitor sites. We have our time-lapse camera stands. We used the SMAS drop camera survey during one of our or drop camera system during one of our programs, and we've also evaluated a REMIS system. And each of these systems have their own pros and cons. However, one of the things I would like to point out with optical surveys and having handled enough of them is that a con for all of them or consideration is that more pictures can be more problems. There needs to be consideration for data storage, processing, how to disseminate and share that data amongst groups and other people that are interested. For a site that's about 1 square kilometers, we generate about 1,500 TIFF images. So it's just something to think about when monitoring a site overall, is it's going to take time versus using a dredge where you get the data right away, but you still have to, with images, you have to post-process it. So with our optical platforms, this was in 2013, we used the SMAS drop camera, and what we had stations 500 meters apart. We were able to look and see that across the site densities changed. However, at a 500-meter spacing, you no longer see the actual kind of change in density that we would expect or get an idea of the dispersal pattern. With a towed optical survey vehicle that has continuous transects, we were annotating 1 in every 10 image, which equates to an image being about 4 meters apart. And what we found is that you can actually detect kind of patterns in dispersal. So what we noticed is that while density decreased dramatically or the net change in density was dramatic closest to the original drop site, we actually had an increase in density or net density around 200 to 400 meters out. And then beyond that, any changes in density became less detectable. We were also able from these numbers to kind of calculate a displacement rate for sea scallops, which was about 6.8 centimeters per day. So in addition to like the larger scale dispersal across the site, one of the things we've also been interested in is fine scale dispersal and dispersal related to predation, as well as impairment caused by the relay mortality. So what we found with their time-lapse camera stands, which we can deploy at the time was between 12 and 48 hours, but we have now improved battery capabilities, and they can sit at a site for about 4 to 6 weeks. We estimated a dispersal rate on average was about 30.4 centimeters per day, compared to the optical survey method estimate, which was 7 centimeters. The higher dispersal rate could also be one related to transplanting, could also be related to predator-prey interactions that we observe with these stands. And so that being said, here's some video that we collect from our time-lapse camera stands showing some sea scallop predation by sea stars. Under these stands, we have a Maryland-style crab trap that we load up 100. In this experiment, we were putting 100 sea scallops in. They're all tagged. When we annotate the images, we try to read the tag number, and we can track individual locations within the frame. Then what we also are trying to do is look at how scallop movement changes relative to how close they are to a sea star or other potential predator. The other thing we did with these scallops is we do a ramp assessment of them where we assess their reflex and damage and provide a score. And what we're hoping to do is relate some of the observations in these stands to the reflex scores to determine whether the scallops that are more likely to be predated upon are suffering impairment or damage from the transplanting process, or if it's just random and scallops are all likely to be eaten. Yeah, we have observed crab predation. So as Dora brings up, so we've observed crab predation, sea star predation. One of the most interesting things that we have observed is actually moon snail predation. prior to doing this work, there's one or two older journals in Canada that cite a captain talking about moon snails, but as far as a moon snail predator being a major predator, we had no long, previous to a lot of our work, we had not thought that they would be major predators. And we have, I think right now, 5 documented events of moon snails eating sea scallops. And it's a very interesting way in which they eat the sea scallops. They grab them, they engulf them, and either they'll bury right in the front field of view or drag them out of the field of view. But overall, though, the predation that we have observed is relatively low. About 3.3% of the animals that we've put on the bottom under these stands end up being lost due to predation. And like I said, our current work, what we're looking at is relating some of the damage and reflex scores to the observed predation to try to determine if the scallops that we're seeing that are eaten are ones that were damaged in the process of being transplanted. So another thing that we've been primarily focusing on too is looking at ways to reduce incidental or relay mortality, as we kind of refer to it. So this mortality is specifically the mortality related to the transportation between the harvest site and the transplant site with gear considerations. So we tested multiple trawl variants. They include a yellowtail trawl, a monkfish net, and a 2-panel box net or a sea scallop trawl. And we also tested a traditional scallop dredge. What we found though was that the 2-panel box net was the least damaging gear to sea scallops, and it could move significant volumes of scallops. However, when using trawls, one consideration that should be taken in for a larger transplanting scheme is bycatch. Relative to a sea scallop dredge, the trawls and some of the tows had, I think one of our tows had 12 baskets of gray sole, where for a sea scallop dredge, we only had a half. So it's just something to consider when using a gear type that, yes, you're moving scallops, but maybe you don't want to impact other fisheries or sensitive species in the area. So one of the things we also observed was that we put tag scallops out at each of these sites. We were able to recover some of them, and 15% of the ones that we recovered had died. They were clappers when we recovered them at the time for the 270-day period at large. We also made a tow at the site, and we recovered scallops 70 days post-transplanting. They were still alive, and we assumed because we had transplanted them in November and then reharvest them in January that no growth had occurred. So we didn't take meat weights or gonads, and we just released them as alive. When we recaptured some of these scallops, though, that had been caught in January, 272 days later, 91% of those scallops had died. What we think this suggests is that both the trauma from being sequentially captured within the 7 days probably contributed to the high mortality that we saw, but also that when transplanted, scallops probably need time on the bottom to rest, acclimate, kind of find their bearings, if you will, and maybe using a dredge to monitor them within 70 days is not ideal because you'll end up offsetting any gains or expected gains from transplanting. So growth. So in terms of growth, one of the ways we looked at growth was using the shell heights collected from the optical surveys of each site between years. In 2020, between 2020 and 2021, we observed an increase in shell height of 6 centimeters in the scallops from the optical survey, which equated to about 0.15 millimeters per day. From the tag scallops that we recovered that had originated from the deeper site where growth was poor, we had observed 0.024 millimeters of growth per day. And relative to the site where they had come from in the Nantucket Lightship Deep, the growth of that area as calculated by our tows data was about 0.46 millimeters. So we saw an incredible amount of growth in these scallops. They essentially went from 36 count meats to 17 count meats through the transplanting process. So that all being said, with these projects, there's some challenges and opportunities that we've experienced. So like the Seastead project, siting has been kind of a huge issue. Protecting transplanting sea scallops can be difficult. You need to have consideration for both the other existing fisheries within the region, including the sea scallop fishery. There's two fleets of the sea scallop fishery, the limited access and the limited access general category. Each of these fisheries use areas differently, and consideration needs to be taken to how each of those groups use it, as well as other fisheries like lobstermen, other draggers, use these areas. So when placing scallops in an area, we want to protect them from fishing effort, but we also don't want to displace other fishermen that are working in the area. And then with the emergence of offshore wind development, this might displace fishing effort for one, from these areas, but it could also provide a de facto refuge for scallops if scallop fishing is prevented from in these areas. The other thing is some recent work done by a group at Hui had indicated that the construction activities from pile driving for placopectin may increase mortality due to interrupting their ability to escape and increasing their energy consumption. So transplanting might be a method to restore beds that are lost due to wind turbine construction. And then a larger question that within transplanting is site preparation. Should predator removal be done? How can it be done? And what are the considerations within an ecosystem management framework? We know sea stars are predators of sea scallops. Crabs, as Devora pointed out, moon snails. For some of the species like Jonah crabs, there are fisheries for them, but for moon snails and sea stars, there's no fishery. So what gear type was the best way to remove them? You develop a market, how do you get rid of them? I mean, so these are all larger questions towards site preparation. But ultimately, from our research, what we want to say the key takeaway is that site selecting is doable. Monitoring and sourcing seed is relatively achievable. Stock assessments do a great job at identifying high density seed areas. They're able to also identify whether these high density areas are experiencing negative density dependent growth, which might make these beds more of a candidate for transplanting. And then what we also noticed is that immediate loss from predation is relatively low, and we believe that it's linked to impairment due to relay mortality. The other thing is that we have from our Nantucket Lightship South Deep work is that we do believe that growth can be improved by transplanting, but we need to balance bed density, site productivity, the environmental conditions within the site, as well as the site's protection from fishing effort and other user groups in the area. So that being said, I would like to thank all the fishing industry partners that we worked with throughout the course of this 10-year research, the funding sources through the RSA that provided the financial support, as well as our past research partners, both through the Seastead and some of the RSA work we had done. And I do realize I had left some of their fishing partners out, so you guys can find me in the audience.